It's all your dough.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, this is Christina here from Gulf Coast Sourdough. I have my helpers. I've got Catherine and I've got Julia. And we are here in our home kitchen here in Seminole Heights, and we are very excited to mix up a multi-grain sourdough recipe. We're doing this selfie mode, so it's a little, we're testing out the kinks. So a lot of people have asked us about baking with different grains. Last week we did a couple of different recipes, but they all used white flour, bread flour, and we know that a lot of people are interested in integrating different grains, whole grains, into their recipes. So we are here to do that. DC is out. And show how you can incorporate whole grains into your sourdough baking. So first, a couple of things about whole grains. What is a whole grain? It is flour that has the whole part of the grain, hence the name whole grain, with it. They, you see them in the store, you know, there's whole wheat flour, obviously, that's probably the most common one. There's white whole wheat flour, and then there are different ones that you might have seen, like rye flour, or einkorn is one, just different grains that you can use and incorporate into your baking. So different grains have different amounts of gluten, or they have none at all. So we talked last week about the gluten in a dough is the protein in the dough, and it's kind of what gives it its structure. Those gluten strands throughout the recipe provide that structure, and then they create those air pockets that allow for your dough to develop and be able to hold its shape as a loaf. So the less gluten that there is in a loaf, the less your dough will be able to hold its shape. So just be mindful of that when you're incorporating flours into your dough that don't have gluten, or that have less gluten than bread flour. Bread flour is very high gluten because it's specifically designed to hold your bread together and to provide that structure and shape. Different grains have different amount of gluten, so just keep that in mind as you're baking. Also, the bran and the hull that are in whole grains.
Mama, you don't have one in.
I know. I'm going to mix it up on camera and show everybody how we do our recipe, okay? The bran that's in whole grains will reduce the ability of your dough to create those air bubbles like we just talked about with the protein and the structure. It also impacts the airiness of your loaf. So that's why whole grain breads tend to be a lot more dense. We do one at the bakery, which is our German seed bread, which is 100% whole grain. And people are always surprised by it because it's small, it doesn't get as big, and it is very dense, and that's because of it's 100% whole grain. So usually what we do is we do multi-grain breads. We do some bread flour, and then we do some of the whole grains as well. Your whole grains that are in your recipe will absorb more water than the white bread flour that's in a recipe, just because that's the way they're structured. So sometimes they feel stiffer and they feel drier.
Oh yeah, don't do that.
Hey, you girls okay? And then the last thing is that, like I just talked about, whole grains are denser than loaves that are just made with white flour. And so the more whole grains you have in a recipe, the denser your loaf is going to be. So that's why we mix grains together and do things that way. All right, you girls ready to get mixing?
Yeah!
Yeah!
Oh, we're making sourdough.
Yes, so our helpers here are making the same sourdough recipe that we did last week. I've already pre-mixed it for them so they can get going. You girls can start mixing up your breads.
Right now?
They were very excited about the little tins that we had for them and making their own kid-size breads. So they're doing a regular white flour sourdough recipe. I'm going to mix up our multigrain recipe. So what do I need? I have my mixing bowl, of course. We're doing this on selfie mode, so there's no like zooming in. I have my food scale like we talked about last week. Measuring things by weight and using the metric system is a lot easier to use when you are baking sourdough bread. I've got my sourdough starter, of course. Here's Bilbo. Last night, Brett fed Bilbo. It was probably around 10 o'clock or so. We went live and showed how you can do it by feel instead of always having to measure out what you're doing. So this morning, Bilbo's nice and bubbly, ready to get into a dough and start making those bubbles. The girls already have theirs. And then I have my water, of course. And I have my salt. Salt is always important in bread. You don't ever want to make bread that is without salt. At least for our recipes, we have never had good results when we have accidentally forgotten the salt. So, and then the flours I'm going to use. So I've got my King Arthur bread flour. That's going to be the white flour that I'm going to use today. And I've got just King Arthur whole wheat flour, regular whole wheat. You can see it's browner, you know, it's just a whole wheat flour. And then I'm also going to use some rolled oats in our recipe. So rolled oats are one of the grains that does not have gluten in it.
Can I see it?
Yeah, you can see it's just oatmeal.
Yeah.
You know how sometimes we eat oatmeal? So they are one of the grains that do not have gluten in it. So that's something I'm just going to keep in mind. Okay. Yeah, it looks like you could mix it a little bit more. See all the dry flour on the side of the bowl. Okay, so I'm gonna get started, and I'm actually making a double batch of this recipe. Last week we did a 3-2-1 recipe. That's still what I'm basing this on. Well, I guess 1, 2, 3. 1 part starter, 2 parts water, 3 parts flour and grains. I'm doing it double so that we want to show you a couple of different ways to shape your loaves. And then this afternoon and evening when we bake it, we're going to be baking it in a Dutch oven. So we're going to show you that technique, and that really helps home bakers get that nice crust that you want to see on your loaf of sourdough bread. Okay, so I've got my mixing bowl, I've got my scale. I'm going to start with Bilbo. So I'm doing 200 grams of Bilbo. Bilbo is our starter.
Ooh, hi, Bilbo. Hi, Bilbo.
Bilbo says hello. See how bubbly and happy Bilbo is?
Yeah.
Bilbo's ready to make some bread, huh?
Bilbo is living.
Bilbo is living. Bilbo is living. Bilbo's like a little pet that we have. And then I'm going to do, okay, so then I'm zeroing out my scale so that I don't have to keep track of how much I have in my head. I can just let the scale do the math for me. So I'm pouring in 400 grams of water. Ooh, am I gonna have enough? Is it gonna go? Almost there.
You know the sink is right there.
Oh, really? Where's the sink?
Right there.
Oh, okay, cool. With all those dirty dishes in it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, cool. All right, so I've got my water. And now I'm going to start adding my flour. So the total amount of flour I'm going to have, I did 200 grams of Bilbo, 400 grams of water. So I want 600 grams of flour. I'm going to split that evenly between my King Arthur bread flour and my King Arthur whole wheat flour. So I'm doing 300 grams of the bread flour. I'm just going to start dumping it in, getting up to 300 grams. What's the matter? You okay?
I need to go potty.
Oh, okay. Jules, can you help her go potty?
Yeah, but at first I have to wash my hands.
Yeah, you can rinse off your hands. Okay. And now
I'm
we are keeping it real here. Right?
Okay, she doesn't
Suddenly
have
our
to.
3-year-old has to go potty in the middle of mixing up our dough.
She doesn't.
Okay. Maybe right after we're done doing this, we'll make a nice bathroom run. All right. Getting almost up there to 300. Okay, well, went a little bit over, so I'm gonna scoop some out. All right, there we go. And then, of course, my salt. I'm putting in about 12 grams of salt. What is it, sweetie? What is it, sweetheart?
Can I say hi, Daddy?
Yeah, you can say hi, Daddy.
Hi, Daddy. Hi, Daddy.
Okay, so I'm done with my scale, and I have my bowl of everything, and I'm just gonna start mixing. And we talked about it. We did a demonstration last week with our 3-2-1 recipe. I'm going to be using my fingers.
Hi, Mama.
Hi, darling. We're just mixing in the bowl. This was another technique that we talked about last week to make sure that you don't add too much flour into your dough. And also to reduce the amount of dishes that you have to do and the amount of cleanup that you have to do. A lot of recipes call for flouring a surface and kneading your dough on the surface. We like to just keep it all in the bowl, then you're not tempted to add more flour. That's cool. All right, so my dough is coming together. And it's a little wet and a little sticky. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna add some of those rolled oats that I talked about, probably about 50 grams or so. And just incorporate those into my dough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I want a nice multigrain bread.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the nice thing about sourdough baking. As you, okay, you can add some of those into your bowl, sweetie. Go ahead.
I do not want to.
As you continue to do it, as you get more comfortable doing it, you're gonna know what you want your dough to feel like. I want my dough to be a little stiffer, so I'm adding more grains to it. I'm adding those rolled oats that will absorb more of the water in my recipe, and also provide more fiber, provide all that good heart-healthy stuff that people look for when they're making recipes with whole grains. Did you add some in, Bubba?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
Can do you want me to help you? Do you want me to help you mix? No.
No.
You really need help, or do you need to go potty?
All right, so my dough is really well come together. It's basically pulling off the sides.
What about this one?
Yours is looking good. Really good.
Yeah, but my hands aren't.
Well, that's okay.
Ooh.
So this is my dough. I'm gonna hold it up. You can see it's kind of dotted with the rolled oats and everything. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just going to cover it with a towel and I'm gonna let it rise on the counter all day. And then this afternoon, we're going to pull it out. We're going to shape it. Like I said, we're gonna show you some different shaping techniques and we're gonna show you how to bake in a Dutch oven. So that's it for now. Thank you. And we will see you this afternoon. Bye. Girls wanna say bye?
Bye.